The subject of this last instalment is Arthur Machen's posthumous publications, but it is worth mentioning that in Machen's lifetime he was published in the classic Weird Tales magazine. The Bowman had been reprinted in 1928 and The Lost Club in 1935. And in 1944, Famous Fantastic Mysteries reprinted The Novel of the White Powder, and in 1946, The Novel of the Black Seal. They also published, in 1950, The Strange Occurrence in Clerkenwell. Machen had therefore been noted in certain quarters as a horror writer, but his posthumous reputation was probably established more than anything by the publication of Tales of Horror and the Supernatural by Knopf in New York in 1948. It was reprinted by the Richards Press in London in 1949. It was a very important book in establishing Machen as the author of Tales of Horror and the Supernatural, by which I mean not mystical stories, which would have been a possibility, or tales of terror, which would have been marketable but incorrect. Tales of Horror and the Supernatural is a very good collection, although The Bright Boy might have been swapped for any number of better stories. The collection appears to have been the basis or source material for various reprints in the 1960s, helping to define how we thought of Machen through the 1950s, 60s and 70s. But there was still an appetite for Machen among American collectors, beautifully catered for by the publication of Bridles and Spurs in 1951 by the Rofant Club from Cleveland, Ohio. There were 178 numbered copies in a slipcase. It's a collection of essays, and it's probably the most sumptuous and elegant of Machen's books, on beautiful paper, with printing in red, with gilt highlights. The Americans also produced a critical essay in 1953. There were 50 copies privately printed. And the Four Ducks Press published letters by Machen called ALS, which stands in book dealing terms for autograph letter signed. There were 50 copies in 1956, which was followed in 1959 by a note on poetry, and in the same year from the London Evening News, all in 50 numbered copies. I assume that these enthusiasts were the precursor of the original Arthur Machen Society, which was a loose collective started as early as 1957 when membership lists were printed and circulated. I don't believe there was an actual subscription, and the four occasionals were published between 1963 and 1971, but these publications were paid for by well-off interested members of the society and sent out for free. In France there was the publication of letters between Machen and P.J. Toulet in 1957. Toulet was the translator of The Great God Pan into French. Between 1949 and 1971 there were studies of Machen published by Geckel, Sweetser and David Parry Michael, each good in their own way and with their own strengths. At the same time of the mass-market horror paperbacks in the 1960s, Reynolds and Charlton's excellent biography of Machen was published in 1963. The extremely exhaustive bibliography of Machen by Goldston and Sweetser was published in 1965. Collectors being what they are, I was pleased to buy a copy signed by one of the bibliographers, Adrian Goldstone. In the 1970s there was a Village Press reprint of the London Adventure, but it was going very quiet. By the early 1980s, everything by Machen was essentially out of print. But if he was forgotten about by the publishing world when I first became interested in him, it was relatively simple to amass a good collection of his books via second-hand bookshops and dealers, the basis of this collection that I've been presenting in these videos. All but the real rarities seem to be available for £10 each. One can trace the origins of the current Machen Renaissance back to Apostle of Wonder, a booklet published in 1985 by Mark Valentine and Roger Dobson under their Command Books imprint. It was followed by Artist and Mystic in 1986, the same year as the inaugural meeting of a new Arthur Machen Society, based in Wales. 1987 was the year of the first issue of the Society journal, Avalonius, and it went through 17 irregular issues, reprinting much that was obscure and difficult to come by. Command Books continued and Tartarus Press was started up. But in 1988, Duckworth published The Collected Arthur Machen, almost a major publisher, with good distribution. The main strength of the collection was the fact that it included The Hill of Dreams. In the same year, 1988, The Selected Letters was published by the Aquarium Press, edited by Roger Dobson, Bob Gilbert and Godfrey Brangham. Small press publications continued, many just booklets, appearing in both the UK and the US. I'll only mention one Tartarus Press book, Ritual and Other Stories, published in 1992. It was essentially a collection of Machen's fiction that I had found in many obscure and out-of-the-way publications. It excluded stories that were, by then, available in Tales of Horror and the Supernatural, Holy Terrors, etc., books that were still easily found second-hand, and which would be expected to be in the collections of any Machen admirer. The 4 different editions each changed contents, adding new material subsequently unearthed, and removing stories that were then available elsewhere. 1995 saw the publication of Mark Valentine's excellent biography, published by Seren Books. The Friends of Arthur Machen essentially took over the baton from the previous Arthur Machen Society, and has now published 40 issues of a hardback journal which regularly includes rare and important material by and about Machen. It is now ably edited by Tim Jarvis and James Machin. The Friends of Arthur Machen have published a number of standalone books of some importance, but perhaps none more so than Galsworth's Life of Machen, which had languished unpublished for many years. It was edited by the late Roger Dobson. It has to be admitted that the sudden blossoming of books by Machen has coincided with his work going out of copyright. There is a large amount of rubbishy print-on-demand material available, but there are also lovely books by various small presses, and there are books published by prestigious publishers such as the Library of Wales, Oxford Classics, and Penguin Modern Classics.